Good evening. Welcome to this meeting of the Centre for Geopolitics. My name is Brendan Sims. I'm the director of the Centre. I've got here to discuss our book on English violence in Europe, Karine Varley from the University of Strathclyde, and David Trim, my co-editor from Andrews University. We had originally planned to have Professor Sönke Neitzel of the University of Potsdam as the chair of this meeting, and he is in fact among the participants. But I'm afraid we haven't yet worked out, and I apologize for this, how to get him online. But my hope, Sönke, if you're hearing this, that we can somehow include you. And if we can't, as I say, I apologize. So, David, I'm going to turn to you first as my co-editor on this project. Just briefly, if you would, to summarize the argument of our book.
Thank you, Brendan. So the argument today is that impressions of the British state as an upholder of international norms is not as well understood as it should be. Britain is a normative power, or it has been regarded as such, and has often sought to defend and export values and norms based on ideas of representative government, of individual liberty, the liberal international order, and so forth. This has often been contrasted with ruthless, extreme violence perpetrated by the British government in colonial contexts. Historians have emphasized the extent to which actions carried out in Ireland and to some extent Scotland and Wales were generally within a colonial framework rather than a European one. But what this misses is the extent to which England and then Great Britain and the United Kingdom have inflicted extreme violence on its European neighbours, even when still using the rhetoric of neighbourliness and friendship. And so the book examines this willingness of first the English and then the British governments to use extreme violence, even what we today would call atrocities. And we take this roughly from the siege of Harfleur in 1415 by Henry V down to the firebombing of Hamburg in 1943. The book doesn't look at crimes carried out by individuals. It looks at violence sponsored by the state, whether directed by statesmen and politicians, such as the decisions to bombard Copenhagen in 1807, or the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir in 1940, which Karine Varley will talk about in a moment, or to devastate Germany by bombing in World War II. But we also look at ruthless violence directed by instruments of the state, such as military commanders. So the interest isn't in the extreme actions carried out by individuals, which all soldiers carried out in all wars. It's looking at violence directed by the state or by its instruments, such as military commanders. In other words, we're concerned with actions that were top down and directed and perpetrated often for specific geopolitical or strategic reasons. And so we look at this history, and we look also at the extent to which awareness of past actions informed future usages of extreme violence. I think that probably does justice to the volume, Brendan.
Thank you very much. So you've put your finger, I think, on a very important point, which is that we're dealing with state violence and not individual violence, and that we're focusing on Europe. The clue, obviously, is in the title. And as you say, the volume reaches back quite considerably in time, so it spans many centuries. And you, of course, have covered an aspect of the early modern period. And I just wondered whether you could give us a bit of a sense of what you wrote in that chapter and how it bears on that overall picture that you've just elucidated.
Happy to do so. So my chapter 4, is on military violence during the reign of Elizabeth I, especially in France and the Low Countries. There is a separate chapter in the book on Tudor and Stuart warfare in Ireland, waged against the indigenous Irish, which was often marked by atrocity. My chapter considers both atrocities committed against English soldiers and committed by English soldiers, because this was a period of ruthless violence as a result of the Reformation, which fragmented the unity of Christendom, and which meant that soldiers on the other side were not merely enemies, they might be regarded as evil in a sort of cosmic sense. English soldiers regularly were the victims of massacres, but they also perpetrated, and they did so with their commanders' awareness and blessing. In 1572, the Dutch revolt against Spain began. The capture by the rebels of the strategic port city of Flushing sparked wider resistance to the Spanish, but the rebel forces in Flushing would have been too few were it not for the arrival of a substantial English and Welsh force raised by great nobles of Elizabeth I and commanded by a courtier, Sir Humphrey Gilbert. The Anglo-Dutch forces moved on to the city of Bruges, on the other side of the Scheldt estuary, where they called on the Spanish governor to surrender. In refusing, the governor sardonically asked Gilbert to keep his army before the city walls because a relieving army would soon arrive, and then he promised the English would all be hanged. The enraged Gilbert responded in like terms. A contemporary source says he swore divers oaths that he would put all to the sword unless they would yield. But the assault on Bruges was repulsed, and the Anglo-Dutch force retreated back to Walcheren Island, which prompted the Spanish to make a follow-up attack. Roger Williams, a Welsh soldier who was part of the force at Flushing, later recalled, "To do it the more terribly, they," that is the Spaniards, "prepared a great number of halters, giving them to their soldiers with a commandment to hang all the prisoners they should take." But the English were in a better state than the Spaniards suspected, and in battle, quote, "gave them a full overthrow," after which, as Williams later recalled with satisfaction, "our men hung a number of them with their own halters." To be clear, this was not a matter of refusing to take prisoners and killing men in hot blood. This happened not infrequently in 16th century as in 20th century warfare. Rather, we're talking about accepting the surrender of enemy troops and later executing them in cold blood. These were atrocities. In 1574, during the celebrated siege of Leiden, whose garrison included English troops, a Spanish captain, according to one of the English soldiers, flew the bloody ensign, signifying that his troops would take no prisoners. The garrison sallied and captured the flag along with a number of prisoners. The latter they hanged, and the bloody flag they flew in turn from their own walls as a symbol to other Spanish troops. When the English soldier John Norris, commanding a force of English, Dutch and Scottish troops, stormed the city of Mechlin in 1580, an English chronicler describes how, after initial resistance, everyone cried misericord, that is, mercy, and fell pitifully at the feet of the soldiers who, finding victory, used not much extremity. However, not only is there an implication that this was unusual, but also the same chronicler then notes the number of all those that were slain were not above 200 persons, and yet this is the outcome of when there was not much extremity, and mercy was granted by a force 2/3 of whom were English, and yet 200 people are killed. There was a ruthless streak in English soldiers' mentality that could come out whenever the chips were down. If Sir Humphrey Gilbert, before the walls of Bruges, threatening the Spanish that he would put all to the sword, was plainly motivated by retaliatory considerations arising from the Spanish threat of atrocities against his own force, Norris at Mechlin had no grievance he was taking reprisal for. In any case, English commanders could go well beyond simple tit-for-tat retaliation. For example, in October 1595, the commander of the English army in the Netherlands, Sir Francis Vere, bombarded a Spanish fort into submission. 6 weeks earlier, Francis's older brother Robert had been involved in a cavalry skirmish and had surrendered, but then been killed. He fell into the hands of an Italian officer who, as a contemporary reported, cruelly murdered him in cold blood. After the fort surrendered, Sir Francis Vere selected half the garrison and had them executed, likewise in cold blood. If reprisal for his brother might understandably have been on Francis Vere's mind, killing half the garrison went rather beyond what might have been seen as reasonable even in the 16th century. So there was a ruthlessness in English troops that would be unveiled at times of stress. And again, we're talking here about episodes that are directed by the commanders rather than being the outrages of individual soldiers running to excess. So given the picture that we've seen, the Elizabethan period fits into the longer term history of English and British violence in Europe.
Thank you. Now, some people would say that's all very well and tragic and unfortunate, but are the English any worse in this respect than any of their continental rivals? Is there something distinctively English about this?
There isn't something distinctly English about this, because English soldiers were also massacred I could give a number of examples where English soldiers were taken prisoners, their surrender was accepted, and then in some cases days or even weeks later they were executed, essentially for being Protestants. If we go back further, Neil Murphy's chapter on atrocities under Henry VIII does suggest that the English were more distinguished, if that's the word, at this form of warfare than were even their French and Spanish and imperialist counterparts. So there is a sense, certainly the English are not alone in doing this. One can't say that this is distinctly English. But the English do have a reputation for being this kind of for this kind of extreme action, and so it's not distinctly English, but the English are very good at it. And as I say, there's a ruthlessness to English soldiers that comes out even while at the same time their commanders are speaking the language of chivalry and ethics.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very striking series of events that Neil describes, and this sense in continental Europe, or at least among the imperial commanders, that the English have a particular capacity for the infliction of violence in the early 16th century. Now, I'm happy to say that Professor Sönke Neitzel, our chair, has actually managed to join us. I apologize, Sönke, for the delay. Your arrival is fortuitous, because we've just had David talk about his early modern chapters, and I was going to move on and talk about Copenhagen, but I wondered whether I should now relinquish the reins to you. You might say a few things that you'd originally planned to do, and then we might resume, as it were, the originally planned course of action.
Yeah. So first of all, my apologies for being so late. It's IT problems. We in Germany at universities use Zoom and not this system. But however, I don't know how we solved it, but we solved it. So it's my great pleasure to be in this webinar. I myself, I'm at the University of Potsdam professor. I call it War Studies. And we do run a research project on a similar topic on the military cultures of violence. So therefore, when I met Brandon in Salzburg the other day, I was so much interested and fascinated from this edited collection, which is, I think, a wonderful contribution to scholarly research. And just one remark why this book, I think, is so important. I think we discussed intensively in the last decades mass violence. We discussed genocides, especially in my country and on my country, of course. We discussed colonial violence. And when we discussed the 7 Years' War, other wars, we immediately stick to the French and Indian War, the war in India, etc. What was a bit of left aside, I think, were the, in inverted commas, irregular armies, what the regular line battalions did. And I think the focus of this edited collection is so important, that they concentrate on Europe, not on the colonial theaters. They don't concentrate on genocides, etc. And they do concentrate on Britain. And so, having lived in Britain for 4 years, in Glasgow and in London, it was always striking to me that British scholars wrote a lot and very important work on other countries, where Britain somehow was missing in this regard. If it's the regular, more or less regular armies and Europe. So, and then I think you, with your contribution, really filled a gap, a very important gap. And I really liked the approach of the editors and those who contributed a chapter that is obviously not a blame game. It's not the blame game saying, you know, the British are worse than others. This is not the approach. It's also not to blame the military as such. I want to stress that. It's more a 50 Shades of Grey perspective, a grey perspective of various impact factors that we want to learn under which circumstances do states such as England or Britain think that under specific circumstances they can massive violence, excessive violence, transgressive violence is legitimate to achieve a specific goal. And obviously this was always a negotiation process. What kind of violence can I use, or what do I gain? It's always this kind of negotiation process. And this process refers, and the editors made this very clear, to a culture, so a system of values, of norms, also refers to a public discourse. And the interesting aspect to me is there a British, in a given time, in a given campaign, is there a British footprint? Or is this more a description of the time, of the military, of the politicians? And I think when we want to have a final answer to that, it's very complicated because you always have to compare. But I think the volume itself is a very important contribution, because for one reason or another, Britain was somehow left out of this debate. And so from my side, from the Potsdam view, congratulations. And it's a very important contribution. And I think then enough words on that. And I think we go on with Brendan's chapter on Copenhagen 1807.
Thank you very much, Sönke. I'll be very brief. I'd just like to introduce my chapter, which, as Sönke says, is on the bombardment of the Danish capital of Copenhagen in 1807. And the context there is the fact that Napoleon is running riot in Central Europe. He's defeated Prussia. He's really seen off the Russians. He's already cowed the Habsburgs. And the question really is, will he be able to enforce his will on Britain? And key to enforcing his will on Britain is securing a large enough fleet to make the Channel crossing and to deliver the catastrophic effect, if you like, to the home islands. And he can only do that if he manages to hoover up in short order some of the existing navies of Europe. And that is why all eyes turn to Denmark, which in the late 18th and early 19th century is still a pretty substantial naval power, but Denmark is neutral. And the problem for the British administration in London is how to ensure that the Danish fleet does not fall into the hands of Napoleon. And to make sure that doesn't happen, a fleet is dispatched under the command of Admiral Gambier with a land force under the command of General Cathcart. And their job is not to come back from Copenhagen without either having destroyed the Danish fleet or simply taken it away, captured it, and brought it back to the UK. Now, nobody tells Gambier and Cathcart that they are to bombard the city of Copenhagen. That is not part of the original instruction. The instruction simply says what needs to be done in terms of the actual mission. But the problem for Cathcart and Gambier is that they've got very little time before the winter winds and rain set in. And so they can't really starve out the capital. They don't really have enough forces to take it, to be sure of taking it by storm. And so the decision is taken very, very clearly, it's laid out explicitly, to terrorize the population of Copenhagen to such an extent through bombardment that the Danish government will have no option but to give up its fleet. And that is exactly what happens. Copenhagen is bombarded for 3 nights. About 200 people, 200 civilians are killed, about 20,000 or so are made refugees. And then the Danes give up and surrender their fleet, which is then carried off in a rather leaky condition to Britain. So it is an example of rather shocking violence in many ways. It is specifically directed against civilians. It is not sadistic. It is intended to achieve a particular political aim, and it does achieve that aim. And what's particularly interesting, and I think Karine in a minute might allude to this, is that what happened at Copenhagen has a substantial afterlife. In other words, it's picked up across Europe, also in Britain, of course, as an example of the effective and ruthless use of violence. So, for instance, in the early 20th century, when you have the naval rivalry between Britain and Germany, you have the in the Admiralty, you have Jackie Fisher saying we should do a Copenhagen, a preemptive strike on the German fleet. You have the Kaiser and the German naval leadership worrying that they will be subjected to a Copenhagen-style strike. And as we'll hear, I think in a minute, similar arguments and rhetoric is being used in the Second World War. So what starts in the Baltic, the argument is, does not stay in the Baltic.
Should we, Brendan, discuss, or may I ask a few questions to you, or should we go on? What is the strategy of our now?
Well, I think you can, and then maybe we could move on to Karine. Yeah.
So, two questions to you. I mean, in which way do you think the Copenhagen raid of 1807 was specific to the time, or could we argue this is what people done at the time? And there are other examples in which there is naval bombardment, which is directed against civilians, not against the fleet necessarily, but against civilians. Or would you argue, having the time early 19th century, late 18th century, this is really outstanding, and this is there's no other case where such, and also very different to 1801. So there's no other case where this bombardment was deliberately directed against civilians.
Well, there are other bombardments. There are bombardments of Philipsburg. There are bombardments in the Peninsular War, which of course also affect civilians. I think what is remarkable and unique about Copenhagen is the strategic level of the violence. It was violence against civilians at a very high level to deliver a very significant political outcome. So in that sense, it's comparable to another subject we covered in the book by Mary Cox, which is the chapter by Mary Cox, which is on the blockade, which of course is another example of high level violence affects civilians, not merely as collateral damage, as the unfortunate term goes, but it's specifically intended through the damage to the civilian society to achieve a particular outcome. So in that sense, I think it was quite different.
Yeah, and you mentioned Admiral Fisher, and then early 20th century, the rivalry with Germany, and that he suggested to Copenhagen the German fleet. I mean, does he have in mind Copenhagen of 1801, or does he have in mind the Copenhagen of 1807, which is a significant difference? So my reading always was that he had in mind 1801, but possibly if we go to Wilhelmshaven, the main German seaport, naval seaport, does he have any plans to bombard the civilians in Wilhelmshaven? That would be the equivalent.
Yes, I see what you mean. You're quite right. And for those who are on the call who aren't familiar with what happened in 1801, there'd actually been 6 years earlier another attack on Copenhagen, which wasn't so much directed against the Danish fleet, although in fact there was a fleet engagement, but it was more directed to try and lever Denmark out of the League of Armed Neutrality. So another political aim. But you're quite right. An exact analogy would be, it's an analogy in the sense that it results in the destruction of the fleet by hook or by crook, but I don't think Fisher had in mind attack on civilians. Yeah. And you put your finger on something quite interesting, which is that the two attacks in 1801, 1807 sometimes get collapsed in the historical memory. So when Churchill, for example, alludes to it in his memoirs on the attack on Mirza Kabir, which, as I say, Karine will come to later, he seems to conflate those two events.
Yeah. And possibly a very short last question. Would you think that this attack on Copenhagen in 1807 in the course of the 19th century had an impact on the view of the European public on Britain? So was there a reflection, oh, Britain is cruel, Britain is brutal, Britain deliberately aimed for civilians, this was normally only done by Napoleon, on which we knew a lot of atrocities, or is this act somehow forgotten by the wider public? More overwritten by a narrative of British gentleman war, minimum force, etc.
Well, at the time, the immediate aftermath in 1807, 1808, it's pretty widely remarked and negatively. So you've got a lot of commentary, obviously from Napoleonic propagandists, but also from random people in Germany. You even have Americans who are saying, you know, and of course they have their own issues with Britain and the Royal Navy, remarking on it. But what you also get, and this is quite an important point when talking about British violence, you also have realization. So the American voice that I quote is a naval figure, says, yes, this is horrible. On the other hand, the Royal Navy and Britain are all that stands between Napoleon and us. So there's always a balance, I think, in the mind of the wider public between revulsion at violent British actions, but also perhaps an understanding that these actions might be necessary for the greater public international good. And that certainly, I think, was a theme in 1940, which makes a nice segue to Karine, I think.
Yeah. Right. Then I think it makes sense to go on, and because we are still the same level, coastal bombardment, and Karine, Valerie. Have you been introduced already? So I don't want to repeat it myself. If not, at least I can say that you are a lecturer at Strathclyde University in Glasgow, which is very sympathetic to me because I spent a year at Glasgow University, so very nearby. And you are a historian specialized in modern French history, academic posts in Durham and Edinburgh, and your special topics are two things. Vichy is very important, so in 1940 to 44 France, collaboration, etc. And also very interesting to me personally, the Franco-Prussian War and its impact in the decades after the event of 1871. So, Karine, about a few remarks on your chapter on Neitzel beer in 1940.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. So, yeah, I'll just run through briefly what my chapter covers. So my chapter is about the motivations and justifications behind the British attack on the French fleet at Neitzel near Oran in Algeria on the 3rd of July 1940. And this operation resulted in the sinking of one French battleship, damage to 5 other ships, and the loss of 1,297 French servicemen and a further 351 wounded. Now, the aim of the attack was to prevent the French fleet from falling into enemy hands after the French had signed armistice terms with Germany and Italy around a fortnight earlier. Now, for its part, the French government insisted that as a matter of national honour, it would not surrender its fleet, irrespective of the armistice. So the reason that this episode has remained contentious is that the French sailors, of course, were killed by men with whom they had served as allies just a few days earlier. And many in France saw British action as an act of treachery and callous brutality. As an attack conducted against the forces of a friendly nation that had, of course, by that time ceased to fight, the operation also contravened the accepted use of military violence in war. It displayed an apparent ruthlessness that seemed at odds with Britain's status as a liberal democratic pillar of the international community and with the supposed British values of decency and fairness. But as we've just been hearing, of course, it was not without precedent. In British memory, by the time of 1940, Copenhagen had become a sort of shorthand for a decisive preemptive action that had helped secure ultimate victory against Napoleon. And so this memory was used to justify the attack on Neitzel. And indeed, cabinet minutes from the 27th of June 1940 claimed that public opinion in Britain was strongly insistent that the British government take similar action to that of 1807. And a Times editorial a couple of days after the attack also drew explicitly drew parallels between the two episodes, saying that if the 1807 attack had been justified, then the 1940 attack was even more justified because the French ships were already under enemy control in 1940. It was perhaps because the Nazi propaganda in 1940 had been so quick to draw these parallels between 1807 and 1940 that I think it was the reason that Churchill avoided any direct comparisons at the time. And in his memoirs, as we've heard earlier, he makes a reference to 1801 rather than 1807. But what I argue is that the British government in 1940 conceived of its own national interests as being so inextricably bound up with those of the wider international community as to justify violence in the cause of peace and civilization. And the rationale behind the British action in July 1940 developed following the Soviet invasion of Finland on the 30th of November 1940, when, as First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill proposed mining neutral Norwegian territorial waters to prevent iron ore exports from reaching Germany and to hinder a German invasion of Norway. So in a memorandum dated 16th of December 1939, Churchill argued that Britain had entered the war to uphold the values of the League of Nations Covenant, and that in such circumstances they had the right and the duty to abrogate for a temporary period some of the conventions of the very laws they sought to uphold. In the face of a supreme emergency, Churchill argued the letter of the law must not prevent Britain from taking action because, he said, humanity rather than legality must prevail. So taking this notion of a supreme emergency further, Michael Walser has argued that Churchill operated a sort of sliding scale rationale in which the graver the injustice that would ensue from defeat, the more the rules could be broken to avoid that defeat. But the problem is that even though at the time of the Sönke attack, much of Europe was under Nazi control and many feared an imminent German invasion of Britain, the moral imperatives for defeating Nazism did not correspondingly, of course, give the British the right to kill sailors from another state, especially ones that were no longer part of an active belligerent force. So while dealing with such a threat may have been a military necessity, the manner with which the force was deployed was a political as much as military choice. And ultimately for Churchill, it was about showing British resolve to friendly governments, as well as showing British ruthlessness to the unfriendly governments, in other words, the Axis. And above all, Churchill sought to demonstrate that his country's defiance was more than a match for Nazi aggression, and that being a liberal democracy was no hindrance to the pursuit of victory. So the violence, I argue, at Sönke was not some sort of deviation from Britain's moral undertakings or a sign that somehow the mask had slipped, but it was rather that the British government's belief in the moral superiority of its cause became at once a driving factor and a justification for its use of violence.
Yeah, I think every state believed somehow in its moral superiority and used that as an explanation why they crossed possibly specific borders. My question would be, I mean, we have the armistice signed, I think, on the 22nd of June, and then it was put into practice on the 25th of June. And in this armistice between Germany and France, the fleet was left aside. So the Germans did not ask to surrender the fleet to Italian or German ports. So, and then we have a week later, and the fleet was safe more or less in Sönke, so it was not in Toulon, so it was not in Europe, it was not Africa. So, I mean, why did the British not trust then the French government? Because how could the Germans get access to that? It was when deliberately they transferred the fleet from Toulon to North Africa. It was safe there. There was still an army there. I mean, what was the rationale behind that? Did they not trust Petain, and did they thought this was a traitor or something like that? Because it might have been different if the fleet would have been in Toulon or in European waters. It might have been different if the Germans would have asked for surrendering the fleet, but so there was no evidence whatsoever, to my knowledge, that the Germans could take over this fleet. But this was obviously not the perception of the time. But was this in the British calculation?
Yeah, the terms of the armistice were a little bit vague in terms of what the fate of the fleet were. So both the German and the Italian armistice both had similar clauses saying that they did not intend to use the French fleet. So there was no guarantee, just simply this sort of vow that they did not intend to use it. And for the British, they just saw that as not enough. And by that time, I mean, there was real mistrust of the French because of what had happened before, because of the controversy over the evacuation at Dunkirk, and the real breakdown in relations between the British and the French, in which the French had sought these armistice terms and that, you know, they'd said to the British that they would not do this, and so the British by this point just didn't trust the French. The French saw it as a matter of their word of honor, and you know, they still maintained, and this is why it's still a source of contention, that they had no intention of handing over the fleet, whatever happened. And of course, later in 1942, when the Germans do invade the whole of France, and the French fleet does scuttle itself, then they do say that this was evidence that they would have done that if the Germans or Italians had tried to do that. But for the British in 1940, that simply isn't enough. And also, as I suggested, I think it's also a matter of the British wanting to show, particularly the Americans and foreign observers elsewhere, that, you know, that they are going to be quite ruthless, that they are determined to carry on the war.
I think this is a very striking argument that is not also a political act, to show that after this utter defeat, Britain will fight on and will, by all means, more or less. Is there, if we discuss the French fleet from a German perspective, also then 42 in Toulon, the main argument why it was almost useless for the Germans is the Germans had no crew and had no oil. So even if the Germans would have got the French fleet in 1940 or 1942, they just had no crew, at least to man the capital ships, possibly one or two destroyers, but not the two battle cruisers, etc. Was this kind of, the Germans had no crew, and they had just no man, and then also to run these ships. I mean, this was a French spare parts, etc. This was a very unrealistic view that the Germans, this was possibly, doable in the early 19th century and Brandon's time, that you just take over the sailing ships and you integrate them into your own fleet. But this was obviously very, very difficult in the 20th century. So was this a calculation of arguing that was possibly a British admiral making a point? I mean, it's senseless. The Germans can't do anything with these ships.
Well, I think from the point of view of the Germans, I mean, I think there's certainly something to be said for that argument. But I think we also need to bear in mind that the Italians also had an eye on the fleet. And I think they in particular were very keen to get hold of it because of their interests in the Mediterranean. So I think it was probably a greater threat that the Italians take over rather than the Germans. I mean, still the issues would have been the same in terms of crews and so on. But I think probably the threat was more from the Italians than the Germans at that point.
My last question to you is, I mean, obviously there was always a danger to pushing Vichy France into the German hands. And as a reaction, there were air attacks on Gibraltar, not very efficient, but there was some air attacks. And I mean, obviously the reaction from Vichy France, they were not very amused about that. And I think, as Gerhard Weinberg wrote in his big book, The World at Arms, Vichy France fought more against the Allies than the Germans. And and even until November 42. So, but on the other hand, you could say, if they perceive themselves as a sovereign state, what else should they do? If they say, no, we have sovereignty, we have given you our words, and we are independent, and if you're going to attack us, and then also we should not forget the attack on Dakar, we are not going to surrender our sovereignty into the British. So, I mean, fortunately for the Allies, the Paris Treaty of July 41 didn't came into place. The Germans were not using Dakar and Senegal, and there was limited support from Vichy France to Germany. But the course of history could have been different, right? Especially because Messe Kabir had such a big impact, and you're writing on that in your chapter. So wasn't there any kind of reflection of, okay, we're pushing, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if we're pushing the Vichy French into the hands of the Germans, and then we cause all of our problems to our empire, which we want to stop. So wasn't there any kind of cautious voices, possibly, I don't know, from the Foreign Office or from any other places towards Churchill?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, because there's no doubt that the Messe Kabir attack did have a significant role to play in the pivot that Vichy made towards aligning itself with the Axis and seeing the British as the enemy. And I think, I mean, yes, certainly that there was that awareness in Britain, but I think that they calculated that the benefits outweighed the risks from that. But I mean, you know, what happened, of course, was that the British attack then just fed into all sorts of long-standing French suspicions about the British, all these sort of ideas, you know, that the British were only after the French Empire. This is their excuse finally to realise those ambitions, and you know, the British had were the real French enemy. There had been the real enemy all along, and so all of that sort of came to the surface after this. But yeah, I think it was a case of this was deemed to be a price worth paying. Given the threat.
Any kind of cautious voices from any kind of side in Britain say we should not do this? Is this a bridge too far? We should not go. The risk is too big.
What I came across actually in the British archives from the Foreign Office was really quite interesting, because there was a realization around this time that the Foreign Office had totally misunderstood what was going on in France. And they started to sort of realize that they just hadn't understood the French mindset at all. And so this is a moment, I think, for the Foreign Office to kind of have a bit of a reset in terms of their thinking about France. So yeah, I think they perhaps underestimated that they hadn't really understood what the situation in France was, and just how differently France was viewing the events of 1940 to how, you know, they were playing out in Britain.
Right. So I want to ask questions to all of you three authors, and also to bring David in, and then possibly we can quickly open it to our audience for Q&A. I mean, if we read a substantial chapter on the violence in the period of Elizabeth I, and then we have the early 19th century, and then we have the middle of the 20th century. I mean, what are the similarities and the differences? I mean, of course, we could argue it's a totally different time, but I mean, do you see an overlap of British understanding in which situations excessive violence is justified, legitimate? So is there an overlap? Is there an English and British footprint in a way, or would you argue also, David, listening to Brendan's and Katharine's chapters and talks and comments, and then this is nothing to do. We are in a very different period, very different rules. But if there are different rules, what has changed then? So that would be
I think that's an excellent question. Obviously, there is a difference in that atrocity is more widely practiced in the 16th century, despite this being an era when commanders and individual soldiers would have said they adhered to the chivalric ethos. What has changed from the Middle Ages is religion. And so you can find soldiers for example, English soldiers in my chapter, who had previously served in foreign armies without any trouble, because it was understood that a nobleman, which would include gentry in the English context, had the right to choose which sovereign he served, and this was not deemed illegitimate. In the 16th century, because of religion, service for foreign sovereigns is seen as illegitimate, but it's not really down to the sovereignty issue, it's down to the confessional issue. So clearly by Brendan's period, by 1807 and the Napoleonic Wars, the religious element has been somewhat drained out of European warfare. The confessional heat has cooled. But it does seem to me that what we can see throughout the period is that English and British soldiers and statesmen are willing to take actions that would be described as extreme, even by contemporaries. Not just by us with the benefit of hindsight, but even by contemporary standards, they're willing to take actions that would be seen as extreme in order to further their military aims. Now, the people I'm looking at in the Low Countries and France, and to some extent Ireland, though I didn't have time to discuss them in my brief talk earlier, they are taking those actions without reference to the state. And yet, for example, when Sir Richard Bingham, the governor of Connaught, massacres 1,100 survivors of the Spanish Armada who land on Irish shores after the Armada's defeat, he's praised by Elizabeth I. He's commended for that. So even though the commanders on the ground are taking the initiative, it is approved by the state apparatus back in London or in England, and I think that's what you see, or likewise throughout the 18th century and in Copenhagen and in the blockade, which Mary Cox looked at, in Karine's chapter on Mers el-Kabir, and in Richard Overy's chapter on the bombing of Hamburg. If it can enable us to achieve our strategic ends, we are willing to do things that others would condemn, and we ourselves actually might condemn if we were in a different situation. There is that willingness, and so I think there is, even despite the very different culture and practice of the 16th century to the period of Brendan and Karine, I think there is a common thread that winds through it.
I think somewhere I argued war is about winning. We should not forget that. And in the end, because for us, in the 21st century, it's about avoid atrocities. This is very much driven by humanitarian discourse. At the time we are looking at, it's about winning. And if you can't win, or you think you can't win by using this or that force, you should possibly do that. But Brendan, if we hop on to your period, and wouldn't be killing 1,100 Danish sailors who made it to the shore of England and Ireland an absolute impossible act of violence in 1807. So this could be a difference, that things which were possible in 1588, 1589 were not possible and thinkable in 1807. Or would you think anything goes in 1807?
No, I think you're quite right. I think it's hard to imagine a massacre of Danish seamen in that context. On the other hand, if you think, I think it's wrong perhaps to think of and David wasn't saying this as such, but to think of this as a progression towards a more civilized way of doing things. And you see this very, very clearly in Richard Overy's chapter in our book, which is about the air war on Germany. So he begins with the operating framework for the RAF, which in 1939, 1940 is actually very restricted. There's a lot of focus on avoiding civilian casualties. on dropping leaflets and waging war in a much more civilized way. All that goes out the window from 1941-42 onwards because of necessity, because of the situation that the British Empire is in. So I think that underlines your point that, you know, when you have necessity, no matter how much the world has changed, very quickly we're back in a much more brutal and extreme framework. One thing I just wanted to add on the question of the uniqueness, I think where Britain is unique, or at least very unusual, is in that very long historical arc between events, but also with respect to patterns. So if we take Copenhagen, it's already in the mid-19th century, it's alluded to in Andrew Lambert's chapter on the Baltic. The Russians have great concerns that St. Petersburg will be subjected to a Copenhagen-style attack, and it's also discussed by the British. So it's living on 50 years. Then I already mentioned it crops up again very strongly in the early 20th century. Then, as Karine said, again in 1940, and indeed 20 years ago, in the lead up to the removal of Saddam Hussein and the Iraq War, again it cropped up as part of the history of preemptive action. So I think it's not normal anyway for a country to have quite such a record of the use of, I would not say excessive, because that's more of a value judgment, but certainly of extreme violence, justified by necessity, and very often, as I said, accepted also by people who are not English or not British as being required for the upholding of public goods. And that's something we need to be clear about.
Yeah. Karine, what will you think about the continuities and what has maybe changed by the time of the Second World War?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's an interesting question. One of the things that struck me just in terms of the divisions divisions between within the British over the attack was that, on the one hand, you've got the Foreign Office and Churchill who are kind of justifying this, but the people who oppose it are the Admiralty, who are saying that this goes completely against the sort of codes of honour. And so what's interesting is that both in the Admiralty and the French admirals as well, they're sort of saying, you know, that the French are given their word of honour. And so I was really quite struck by this sort of continuation of these, you know, these notions of honour on the one hand, and, you know, within those who are sort of from a military background, but those who are from a civilian background and politicians have no time for this sort of argument at all. And just picking up just on the point that Brendan was just making in terms of the kind of uniqueness and the kind of acceptance of British action where it is deemed necessary. One of the things that's also quite striking about the Mesla Kabir attack is that it's accepted by de Gaulle, who you might have thought would be, you know, one of the strongest critics of that sort of British action. But de Gaulle says very little about it. He really accepts that this is something that was ultimately necessary, and also linking as well to the Allied bombing. I mean, of course, France also suffered from British and American bombing, and that was also accepted by de Gaulle. So there are these, you know, circumstances in which even somebody like de Gaulle, who never missed an opportunity to criticize the British, did accept that this was, you know, one of those circumstances in which there really, you know, was a justification behind it.
Right, so this is possibly the moment to open the floor for discussions and questions to all three authors. And I hope this works technically. But is there anyone in the cyberspace who wants to ask a question?
Thank you very much. My name is Rasmus Bertelsen. I'm a professor at the Arctic University of Norway, and did my PhD in Cambridge 25 years ago, 20 years ago, and Brendan was one of my examiners. Thank you for an excellent seminar, extremely interesting. Karine Varley, if I might just ask you about the last thing you said. It struck me what you said about de Gaulle and Marcel Kibir. And I was just curious to what extent it was, internal French politics between de Gaulle and Vichy, and whether it was like de Gaulle also voicing a criticism of Vichy for not having fought on. Thank you.
So I think certainly in July 1940, I mean, de Gaulle really is just establishing himself, in the Free French. It's very early days, and so this is it's extremely difficult really for de Gaulle to criticise the British because of wanting to make a clear difference between his position and the position of Vichy. And so, he really can't afford to have any differences with the British at that point. But I think you could argue that, as his position strengthens over the course of the war, that he becomes more emboldened and becomes more critical of the British and the Americans. But yet, even despite that, he doesn't go on to criticize Neitzel or the Allied bombing. So, I don't think we can necessarily say that it's simply because of his dependency on the British. I think he just genuinely thinks that actually there was a real kind of military justification behind it.
So Alexander says, unfortunately, I can't unmute myself, but I was wondering about the role of communication in these incidents and deliberations. Is violence often committed on the spot and a justification sought after the fact? And is more extreme violence caused by miscommunication? For instance, I've heard an account of Marcel Kibir, where miscommunication between the admirals on the ground, British and French, caused the actual shelling.
Karine, this would be a question for you, and also David can comment on it.
So on Marcel Kibir, I mean, there is an issue in terms of the terms of the ultimatum that the British give the French. Not all of the terms are communicated by the French admiral who is in charge, Admiral Janssou, to the Vichy government. But that's not really an issue of communication. I mean, actually, there is a lot of consideration, certainly by the British. They do think about the use of violence very carefully, and there is a lot of discussion about it. So it's not just simply something that they enter into without thinking of all of the possible repercussions. And as I said, the Admiralty were really strongly against it, and really argued against it for quite some time.
Right. Are there any other questions? And you can raise.
Can I just come in on that?
Of course, David, of course.
I think there is at times what Alex has suggested is quite right. So, for example, in the Elizabethan period, in the 16th and 17th centuries, generally the people on the ground are acting. But as I say, the other example in Ireland would be the massacre of a force of Spanish and Italian mercenaries hired by the Pope to fight for the Irish rebels, who are defeated and they surrender, but they don't have good terms for the surrender, and the English force executes them all, and Elizabeth I specifically says this was well done. So I don't think it's a matter that people back in the government are then having to, as it were, scramble to justify what was done. I think there's a consensus about what needs to be done, and so commanders can act in the field without needing to have reference back to their headquarters. Of course, by the First and Second World War, it's much easier to be in communication with those headquarters. I think Brendan would also say, even though the force gets sent out to Copenhagen with a very clear mandate, the decision to engage in the terror bombing is decided by the commanders on the ground because of the strategic situation that Brendan described. I think that's right, isn't it, Brendan?
Yes, that's right. But it's not a question of miscommunication. One of the great virtues of the Copenhagen case is that we know exactly what was threatened. The Danes knew exactly what was coming, and the British did exactly what they said they would do. So in that sense, I mean, I know it's different with Oran, Mirza Kabir, and it's different in many cases, but Copenhagen in that sense is clear. Sönke, Robert Fisher has a question, which he put in the chat, but he also says that he can unmute if you like.
I tried to unmute him. So Robert, could you try to speak out, or possibly Samuel can also help us? If it's not going to work, I'm going to read out your question.
Right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's wonderful. Yeah, we can hear you.
Wonderful. Well, my question is, if any of you could say something about, and by the way, thank you all three of you for your excellent presentations. Can you say something about British violence during Mandate Palestine? Is there any evidence that the British in certain ways bequeathed some of their own violence to the communities left to govern Palestine and live in Palestine after the British vacated Palestine?
Who wants to give an answer to that? Or have a suggestion?
Well, I would say in a cowardly way, this is really Karine Varley's decade. but and also I think it would be reckless on my side to speculate on British violence in Palestine because I haven't worked on it. So I don't think I've got anything useful to add on that, but I don't know if Karine has.
I wouldn't really have any particular insights, I'm afraid.
Good question.
Yeah, that's a little bit outside my area.
Yeah. So sorry for that. So we can't answer that question. There are still limits of our knowledge. There's still things to research.
I would just add one thing, which I think probably this would be seen again as being more in the colonial context. And the use of extreme violence by the British in the colonial context is well known. Not as well known as it, even 20 years ago, there was still a British. The British flattered themselves that they'd been very genteel, but in light of recent books on the Mau Mau on Cyprus and so forth, I think we know now that the gloves were very squarely off. So I think we know that the British deployed violence in the colonial setting, but what has been missed, and what the book is trying to say is, this actually wasn't simply the British behaving in a beastly fashion to people they regarded as inferior, because they behave this way to people who are their peers as well when it serves their strategic and geopolitical ends.
Right. Thank you very much.
Can I just add one thing to that? And it's a point that's made in Richard Overy's chapter, that there is a read across between the colonial and the European spheres, in the sense that some of the bombing strategies which are used by the RAF are trialed in the colonial sphere in a much milder form, but actually then achieve their full ferocity when applied against the German Reich in the Second World War. So in that sense, with regard to strategic bombing, definitely the policies in Europe are more severe, in fact, than they are in the rest of the world.
Right. Are there any other questions to ask? Possibly, may I then ask you guys, two final questions, possibly. The first question is, what is the reason why your book was not written 20 years ago or 10 years ago? I mean, we are very happy that we have your book, but what is the reason why, this is an old topic, well researched? And the second thing is, when we all come to our limits in our research, and if you would have a free wish, I do want to know this or that. Is there a core question which you can't solve during writing your chapter? A secret moment that you want to look in the heads of admirals, politicians, whatever. So is there an answer which you, a question which you can't answer? And if the Lord would make this possible, say, what answer would that be? What key question which you're keen to have an answer on, which you can't have an answer on? What would be your point you put your finger on, which is still a miracle to you in this context?
Shall I make a start and then?
Yes, please.
So I think on the first question, which is why was this not written 20 years ago, I think one part has already been alluded to, is that there's been a much greater focus, for understandable reasons, on colonial violence. And so we were concerned to put the focus back where we thought it also belonged, which was on Europe. And secondly, I think that more generally, the study of violence 20, 30 years ago wasn't quite as developed. I mean, you yourself, Sönke, have written very well and very prominently on this subject, but I think it's more of a new field. On the question to which I would like to have an answer for my own chapter, it is, was Napoleon planning to seize the Danish fleet? We have evidence that he actually did put in a sort of a request, but was it really a serious plan to seize the fleet? It's not unlike the question you asked, Karine, about the Germans. Fortunately, I have no way of knowing this. If somebody out there has the answer, I'd be very interested to hear it.
But who wants to go on, David or Karine?
Yeah, I agree with Brendan about why the book wasn't written 20 years ago. I think the pathology of violence is more significant in historical studies at the moment, and therefore it crystallizes the way we think about war and about international relations too, because of course this has implications rather for how we think about English and British foreign policy and their relations to their neighbors in peacetime as well as war. If you know that this is an option, then it must change the way that you relate to a power that presents itself as being so almost benign. It must have implications for international relations as well as war. I think, the question I would most like to know is, what were the commanders of my period actually thinking when they go ahead with this kind of massacres and atrocities? Because these are men who have read chivalric romances and chivalric textbooks. They would say that they subscribe to the values of chivalry, and indeed in some cases they do. For example, the commanders try and restrain violence against women. They make sure that their men don't sack Protestant churches. They do sack Catholic churches, but that's partly for religious reasons. They refrain from sacking Protestant churches. They do abide by the laws of war up to a certain point, and yet at another point they're willing to go beyond. So what was really in their minds when they did this? Is it simple retaliation? As I say, I don't think it always can be. Is it that the religious factor is poisoning them out? How do they actually square their conduct with the values which they would say that they hold? And that will probably forever remain a mystery.
Yeah. Karine.
Yeah, so the question that I wasn't able to answer was basically why there doesn't seem to be a French memory of the Copenhagen attacks that Brendan talked about, because it's very much present for the British, and it's there for the Germans, but there's very little evidence that there's any real sort of French memory, and it really made me wonder as to how a comparison between the British and the French attitudes and use of violence might play out, because of course France also is a liberal democracy and an established democracy at this point, and many similarities with Britain in terms of its role within the international community. But I think also it would be interesting to see how the Republican tradition in France, and particularly the fact that you know, the revolution is very much born through violence, and the traditions, you know, going back to the revolutionary wars, how that creates differences with the British, who of course don't have that sort of history and that sort of vision of their own identity as being bound up with war and violence. So I'd be quite interested to see how a comparison between the kind of French and British attitudes might play out.
Yeah. Right. So the last question has Alex Summers, and I'm going to read that out. So it's in the chat. So on violence and necessity, do we see noticeable changes in what is deemed necessary and what the acceptable threshold of violence to meet that necessity based on the character of individual military commanders? For instance, is Harris given free rein in 1941 over Germany due to necessity, or is area bombing the norm because Harris is appointed? Does Gambia deem the threat of winter so pressing to prompt bombardment, and would another admiral have decided differently? So culture versus personality.
Yeah, Sönke, on the case of Harris, though I didn't write Richard Overy's chapter, having edited it and being familiar with it, I think I can speak to that. The decision for area bombing is not the decision of an individual, it's the decision of a series of committees. And we know this because we have the committee papers, which Professor Overy has worked through and is the expert on. So this is not the decision of one man. This is the decision taken by a series of committees who know that what they're doing will be regarded as wrong by many people, because they very carefully adopt the terminology that they are dehousing German workers rather than killing Germans. They obfuscate, and so they're aware that what they're doing will be regarded as excessive, potentially by many people, and they try to obfuscate that. But it's not a decision. It's not that Harris is a rogue who's given charge and then is allowed to do what he wants. It's a decision taken by a committee process and is a consensus of the British government.
Yeah, just to add on that, we should have in mind that the area bombing doctrine is put into place before Harris became, a week before, something like that, in February 42, before he became head of Bomber Command. And the miracle to me is that the Second World War, we have definitely a radicalization in the British use of violence in the air, but we have less excessive violence on land. So it's very clear that in the understanding of the British, there's an element of un-Englishness. There's almost no hate propaganda, and the understanding of we are not going to kill prisoners. Rape is totally not accepted. And the British are really an exception in terms of violence on land in comparison to the Americans, the Canadians, the South Africans, of course the Germans, the Italians, and all the fascist regimes. So there's containment on land and transgressive violence on air, which is a unique situation because, well, they are all British. I mean, they are all referred to the same committees, the same chief of staff, etc. So this is something we are working on in Potsdam. But David, I totally agree to your point. And is anyone want to talk about Gambia and the admirals and the bombardment?
Well, only to say that the general view was that any other commander would have made more or less the same decision. It was determined by the nature of the mission.
Yeah. Great. So then I think if there are no other pressing questions, it's on me to thank our three editors and authors, and even more so the audience for listening and asking questions. And I would like to end with reading the note. It's really a very interesting read. I can really recommend that. It's a fascinating book. And again, thank you very much, all three of you, to putting so much effort into that and bringing it out to the public. And hope to see you all again somewhere in Europe or the world, wherever we're going to meet. And thank you very much for your time and this evening.